Welcome, everyone, to the Asian Voices Radio podcast, where you'll find real Asian American conversations, including the topics you were too afraid to ask your Asian parents. I'm your host today, Sheena Yap Chan, and our guest joining us today is Crystal Rowe, who is the senior editor at Buzzfeed, writing viral content and quizzes focusing on women, pop culture, and trending stories. She focuses a lot on content around women's interests and also doing illustrations, which are mostly about periods, Disney princesses, and Keanu Reeves. Crystal, welcome to the show. Maybe share a little bit about who you are and what you do.
Hi, Sheena. Thanks so much for having me. Every time I hear the periods, Disney princesses, and Keanu Reeves in a row, it always makes me laugh. But yeah, so as you mentioned, I am a senior editor at Buzzfeed. And what that actually means is that I'm a writer, but I also edit posts from other writers. And as you mentioned, I do artwork as well. So I'm an illustrator. So I do a lot. But yeah, that's me in a nutshell.
Awesome. Well, how did you start at BuzzFeed? I'm sure a lot of people are curious, how do you get a job at BuzzFeed, especially, how did you become a senior editor?
Yeah, it's a very roundabout kind of journey. My professional background is in the entertainment industry, working, in Hollywood. And at the time, I was working at a literary management company, trying to be a writer for like TV and stuff. And I'd been there for a few years. I was just an assistant, so I was like answering phone calls, scheduling meetings, and there had been a previous assistant at the company who'd gone on to work at BuzzFeed. I didn't know her; we didn't overlap at all. But her old boss, who was a friend of mine at the company, would send me her articles, and she was writing at BuzzFeed. At that time, I think BuzzFeed's Los Angeles office had only been open for like a couple of years. It hadn't been very long. And so I got to be familiar with BuzzFeed then. This was probably around like 2014, 13, maybe even, but I think it was 2014. And so, just like a lot of people, well, young people, I guess at the time, because BuzzFeed was still pretty new then, I was like, what's BuzzFeed? This place is funny. Um, and then I was just looking, at the different articles, and there were other artists and writers at that time who were doing a lot of illustrated content. And I have a background doing a lot of like just artwork for myself. I never in a million years thought I would actually be able to be paid for doing stuff like that. But and BuzzFeed has a fellowship program, and they had it was relatively new at that time as well. So I just kind of applied on a whim because I was like, I'm tired of answering phones. I want to, my goal is to be creative. So I applied and, was lucky enough to get an interview. And the people I interviewed were great, really fun. And then I was lucky enough to be offered a position in the fellowship, which was actually pretty daunting at the time because I obviously had a full time job, and like the fellowship was not a guaranteed full time job. It was like I think it was like 3 or 4 months long program. It was paid, but I was like, if this doesn't work out, then what am I going to do? I'm not going to have a job. But at that point, I think I was just like, this is an opportunity. I need to take it, and I did. And luckily for me, it did work out, and I was hired to BuzzFeed full time. And then, I basically worked my way up from the fellowship to being like a staff writer to eventually being editor and senior editor, which makes it sound really easy. It's been over many years. So I've been at BuzzFeed for about 6 years, which in BuzzFeed years makes me like a dinosaur, basically. But yeah, that's the gist of how I ended up at BuzzFeed.
Awesome. Well, thanks for sharing that. That's great. You're able to share your story and mention how you never knew that what you love to do, you could get paid for it. Because especially in our culture, right? You're told to go to school, get a job, and never rock the boat, right? Don't do anything outside of that. Or your parents would be like, drawing, like, how are you going to make money drawing comics, right? And especially, the comics,
100%.
yeah, the comics that you draw too, right? Like you mentioned, you focus on periods, Disney princesses, and Keanu Reeves, right? And maybe share a bit about as to why you draw those types of things on your artwork.
A lot of that I think is a testament to working at BuzzFeed, where it's a very, like I mentioned, young company, and everybody there is just really supportive. And I feel like a lot of BuzzFeed's history and a lot of the things we're most known for is sort of like talking about subjects that are taboo, and just really normalizing things that should be normal. Like talking about periods shouldn't really be that big a deal. Like half the people on the planet more, I don't know, have periods. It's really not a big deal. Although, just traditionally speaking, when, people just, I feel like periods aren't really talked about. Maybe you have like a health class in school. I remember having one growing up where like the school nurse was giving a class on like, here's how to use a tampon, and like she was like yanking on the string, and it like she's like, don't worry, it's fine, it'll never break. The string literally broke off in the class, and like all of us who were like in middle school were like horrified, like what's happening. So but I feel like that's about the only time was I really talked about. Obviously, it depends on how you were raised. Some people's parents are probably more open, and there's obviously books and stuff like that now. But as far as being a BuzzFeed, it's just all about normalizing that and just not taking it too seriously. The fact that like a period product brands for like pads and tampons just use like flowers and it's pink, and the people in the commercials are like jumping and dancing, and it's like that's really not the reality. Is like 'cause most of us are like passed out on a sofa with a heating pad on. So like, this is at this point, been doing it for a number of years, and I feel like it's a lot more commonplace now to sort of joke about the horrors of periods and stuff like that. But a lot of that again is a testament just to being a BuzzFeed and being around other people who are like, yeah, we should make fun of this, and we should use like funny Disney screen caps to like show what it's like to have a period, like like it's like a messed up face of Ariel because your cramps are so bad or something like that. That's just like very BuzzFeed. I feel like it's very core BuzzFeed sort of mentality and how we write posts. Disney princesses again. I feel like was like a mid 2010s. Back in that 15 to 16 era, where suddenly there was this like you know Disney memes were a thing, and now and I don't know if it's just like the people who grew up with the Disney movies in the 80s and stuff are adults, so it's just like this re-embracing and nostalgia for that. So I mean, I'm sure you're aware there's just so much Disney content out there now. But I feel like 5 or 6 years ago, again, when I was starting at BuzzFeed, it was becoming a thing to be like, oh, Disney princesses as X, like whatever. Like I've literally even seen one that's like Disney princesses as Luke Bowl, lukewarm bowls of water, which is just like just like a meme in of itself. So I started doing a lot of that myself as well, just as sort of a joke, but became like a thing, when that show The Mandalorian came out. Gosh, I guess it's been like what 2 years now since it started. And obviously Baby Yoda was a big hit with everybody. It just a coworker of mine was joking, like, "Oh, you're gonna draw like a Baby Yoda as Disney princesses now," and I'm like, "That's actually not a bad idea. That's very funny." So I did it, and I drew it, and it went viral. Like a lot of social media accounts shared it and stuff. So that's just the power of like I didn't create Baby Yoda, I didn't create Disney princesses. I just put them together because I knew the internet loved it. And then Keanu Reeves is Keanu Reeves. Everybody loves him. And I think it was around the time he was not that he's peaked ever, but there was like a lot going on with him. Like I think Sad Keanu, and there was like the whole like cyberpunk game announcement where he was like, like you're beautiful or whatever it was. He was, just like a lot happening with him. And again, it was a natural like, wow, he's like quote unquote the internet's boyfriend. Let's just do him as Disney Prince because that's the perfect mashup as well. So that's kind of like how my brain works, I guess. And that's how my brain works at work a lot, where it's like everybody's talking about this and everybody loves Disney, whatever. So let's just put them together because I can do that.
I love it, especially, you draw about periods, right? Because like we were talking earlier, periods is such a taboo for all cultures, right? For all women. And
Yeah.
it's like something's wrong with us when we talk about it, but it's part of our human nature, especially for women, right? We get it once a month, like you mentioned, it's not flowers and roses, it's leakage or, heavy days or
Mhm.
or cramps, right? Or cravings.
Yeah.
And that's what the
Yeah.
real world is when it comes to periods. Like it sucks, we hate it. And you putting it in a lighthearted way makes us realize, like, this is just a part of life. It's a part of life. And the more we can talk about it, the more we can also normalize it and be comfortable about talking about it. And then we can use that same concept and talk about other things that's taboo in our culture, right? Especially when it comes to mental health. Like mental health is still a huge taboo in the Asian community. One thing I love watching is K dramas because they really show, how they really promote mental health in their shows, right? Really talk about these certain storylines that we can all relate to and realize like this is all a part of life. When you decided to work for BuzzFeed or go for the fellowship or write these comics, were your parents like kind of shocked that you were doing this, or were they like open? I was just curious because sometimes it's either one extreme or the other.
Right. No, I think I'm pretty lucky in that my parents are very supportive of what I do. They don't really fit into that what I consider a cliche of sort of the Asian parents who want all their children to be like a doctor or a lawyer, which I feel like it's a little tired at this point. And I don't know if it's just because we're like progressing as a society. Not to say it doesn't exist, definitely still exists. But I've been very lucky. My parents are very supportive, and like they recognized, my abilities to do art from a young age, and completely, from the get go, been supportive of that. Like my mother, took me to art classes as like an elementary school age student, just because she was like, oh, like, and I don't know, I was too young to remember if it was like, oh, somebody was like, you should take her to classes, or if just, I'm sure she just realized on her own, like, oh, Crystal loves to draw, like, I should like take her to some art classes. So we did that. And then, you know, continued to do it through high school and did, the whole like AP art thing and whatever. And, I actually went to like a private boarding school, so it's a little bit of a strange experience for like because I was like living there, so my parents weren't actively there like every day, but at that school I did excel at art as well. So I think I've just been fortunate along the way to have had people like support and believe in me and like never really question it or be like, don't do that. Having said that, I don't know, like I look back at like it being in high school and like I definitely didn't know what I wanted to do with my life when I was like 18. I feel like that's a lot to ask of anybody at that age. And like I look back and I'm like, it's really surprising that I didn't go to like an art school or something like that for college. I didn't go to art school, by the way, you guys. My art training is pretty informal. I was pretty serious about it through high school, and then it's not like I went to like some art or design school for college. So a lot of like the illustrations and stuff I do now, especially it's all like digital now. I grew up in the 80s and 90s, so everything was, there was no digital artwork there. Um, but everything I do now is like very self-taught, like being able to just use Photoshop or even like the tablets that I use and stuff. It's all self-taught. So I'm sure it's like janky compared to like how other professional artists do it who went to like some design school and were actually taught how to properly do things. But I don't think it really matters when it comes to art. What matters is what ends up on the page. But yeah, so my parents were very supportive. They were never like, why are you drawing? This is dumb. This is like, not a great career to pursue. They were never really like that.
Thanks for
So I think I've been lucky.
Yeah, that's awesome, and that's great that you had parents who were very supportive, right? Because sometimes it takes them a while to understand what you're doing, even if
Mhm.
they have no clue, right? My parents, when I decided to
Yeah.
forge my own path, they were like, "Why would you do that? You already have a job. You're already successful." Like their meaning of successful is totally different from my meaning, right? But I know they do
Mhm.
it because they love me and they care about me and they want the best things, right? Like any other normal parent.
I mean, I think that's where that all comes from. Even if your parents, even with the like stereotypical Asian parent trope of like you need to be a doctor or a lawyer, none of that's coming from a bad place, and I don't think people understand. At least, I don't think so. It's entirely possible. There's humans are all different, but like like you said, it's all about like we just want to make sure you're successful, and in our minds, the easiest way to do that is just to have a career that makes like a lot of money, and they're not wrong. Having money is nice, so you can be comfortable that way, but and I also don't think it's just like an Asian parent experience. I feel like this is a very immigrant parent kind of experience where it's sort of like we worked really hard to come to this country, and obviously we have massive dreams for our children because that's why we're here. And it just seems like the most obvious way to do this is to have like XYZ career.
Thanks for sharing that. And I'm really curious as to you mentioned you attended a private school. Was it you're here in the States? And what was that like? I mean,
Yeah.
we don't hear a lot of that. So
I know. So I'm born and raised in New Hampshire, which is like one of the whitest states you can possibly grow up in, which didn't phase me as a kid, but the older I get and just living I live in Los Angeles now, which is an incredibly diverse place to live. It's just sort of like, wow, yeah, I grew up in a very like white community, and then like just to quickly mention also, I went to college in Scotland, which, like, I don't know what's wrong with me. I just keep going to these very remote, like, white places. But in any case, yeah. So I grew up in New Hampshire. My parents immigrated from South Korea in like the 70s, or I don't know exactly which year, which is also bad. But and then they came to New Hampshire. Long story short, my father was in the military, and the friends he made who were American soldiers there were from like New Hampshire. And so when they came, obviously way pre-internet days, probably writing letters, maybe phone calls back then. It was like, oh, come stay with us. And they happened to be in New Hampshire. So that's how my family ended up in New Hampshire, which is very unusual. I feel like for especially a Korean family, most of them tend to end up somewhere in California, Southern California, something like that. Anyways, so yeah, it was in New Hampshire, and I went to a private boarding school. Going to private schools in New England is not super uncommon. I feel like it's a very New England kind of thing. My brother, I have an older brother. He went there first, so it was just sort of like a natural, like, oh well, the younger sibling's going to go there too. And it wasn't because my parents didn't want us at home or didn't love us. It wasn't like that kind of a boarding school. It was a very preppy, like a lot of the students there are from like New York and stuff like that. I think for my parents, it was just sort of like, I don't know. It seems like it was just for them. What I've been told over the years is like, oh, we knew this would be like the best education you could get. Like our English isn't perfect. Like we had like tutors growing up and stuff, and it wasn't again because we were stupid or anything like that. It was just like your tutors like know English better than we do. They can like really teach you like how you need to be taught, like here, etc. And that's kind of like the private school was sort of an extension of that. But it wasn't far. It was like an hour away from where my parents lived. So I never really felt like I'm so far from home, and oh my god, I was actually really excited. I think that was just very natural in me to be like, cool, I'm like living somewhere fun. This was like predates Harry Potter and stuff, but it was like that.
Thanks for sharing that. And so you mentioned you grew up in New Hampshire, and like you mentioned, right, it's not a typical state that Koreans would go to. Like you mentioned, they'd go to LA. I mean,
Right.
Koreatowns in LA. But what was it like growing up in New Hampshire and feeling like not like being the only Asian kid around?
Yeah, like I said, it didn't really phase me much at the time growing up. I feel like wherever anybody grows up, you don't really think about a lot of that kind of like stuff. I didn't really. Although in retrospect, as an adult, I'm like, oh yeah, I probably faced a lot more aggression and racism than I even like realize on a daily basis. I feel like you just kind of get used to like how things are. Not that it was particularly bad. Like it was fine. I had a nice childhood and stuff. Um, I don't know what more to say about that other than it was fine. I mean, growing up in New Hampshire, regardless of whether your parents are immigrants or not, is pretty remote. So, maybe it gets a little boring. Me and my friends were all like, I want to like drive to California and go to school there, that kind of thing. But I feel like it's a very like small town adolescence kind of thing. I will say Sorry, I will say, so obviously there were like no other Koreans in the town growing up. I believe my parents were like the first registered like Koreans in their town or something like that, which is funny. But like obviously, and again, I think this is very common in like immigrant families, Korean families growing up in sort of especially remote places. Church is a big part of like your life. So we would go to church like every Sunday. And it wasn't because we were like super religious or anything like that, but I feel like there's a large the thing with Korean churches is that it's like a community thing. So you like gather, and especially where we were, where all the Korean families were pretty remote. Like the church we went to was like in Massachusetts. It wasn't no Korean churches in New Hampshire. So it was in Massachusetts. So we'd go there every weekend. So I don't know. It was weird. It was sort of like I knew there other Korean families and stuff around, but they were all really far, and I would just see them on like Sundays, and it was like you hang around with the other kids, but like they weren't like close friends or anything like that. Because again, pre cell phones, pre internet, it's like how would I be keeping in touch with these kids?
Thanks for sharing that and sharing your life story. It's kind of like that movie that just came out with Steven Yeun. I forgot the name, but
Yeah, Minari.
yeah, Minari, it's all about their
Yeah.
life also in a small town
Hmm.
and, what they did to live the American dream. And I know, when we immigrate to places like Canada and America, that's what we want to strive for, right? The American dream, no matter what it is, whether it's having a successful job or opening a business. I really love that movie because it really illustrates what, Asian immigrants had to go through to want the American dream, right? They sacrifice a lot. They work long days, over the heat. They went through challenges and be able to overcome it. I mean, were there any challenges that you went through in your own career and journey that kind of helped you shape who you are today?
I mean, probably not to the extent of the family in Minari. That is a great movie, by the way. And there was a lot of elements about that that I was like, oh yes, this is great. And this is like a very good example of like representation on like the big screen, right? Where it's like, yes, this is very similar to like my family story growing up. Not that my parents were starting a farm, but this idea of like they were like out in the middle of nowhere as well. I think they were somewhere in the Midwest in that movie, and I'm like, yeah, it reminds me of being in New Hampshire in the middle of nowhere. And there's a lot of like interesting elements in that film that were touched upon about like assimilation and sort of like like the little boy with the grandmother being like, I'm not pretty, I'm handsome, whatever. Like there's obviously like language barrier issues and stuff like that. So, um, Yeah, I mean, I think it's really different between being an immigrant parent and just being the child of immigrants. The experience is really different, and the issues are different, and the things that make you angry are different, and there's just so many more layers of, like, it's hard enough about being a child of immigrants, and then just, like, adding on just being a kid in general. It's just hard.
Yeah, that's for sure. I mean, there's always like a barrier, right? You try to grow up in the Western culture, but then you still have like your Asian culture, like telling you you can't do this, you got to do this. If you speak your mind, they think you're being rude, and it's just like you're caught in the middle.
Yeah. And that never goes away, by the way. Like, I'm much older now, and like there's still things that come up
Still
that's
the
like,
same.
I guess we just don't understand.
Yeah. Well, on another topic, what are some topics or content that are being produced and featured on BuzzFeed for those who may not have heard of
Mhm.
BuzzFeed yet?
Yeah. So BuzzFeed, we cover a lot. I mean, we have a side that's purely news. It's like they're straight up news people, total journalists that cover serious topics, like say what's going on in Afghanistan and stuff. And then the side that I'm on, which is like the BuzzFeed.com site, is like the fun like lists and quizzes. So you'll find anything from like a list of like funny like internet cats to like a quiz about like which like French fry are you or something like that. So we're kind of just like a plethora of anything you can imagine. We try to like really think about our audience and like think about like who even if it's like niche, like what's the identity there. So like for me it could be like short girls or people who grew up Korean, or like we've talked about people who have periods, or just people who have small boobs, something like that, which is another like, maybe that's like more taboo amongst like the broad like audience, but for us, it's like it's cool, it's fun to talk about. We want to be body positive, and stuff like that. Lately, I've been doing a lot of like pop culture stuff. Just writing about like weird movies or shows. It kind of like it comes in waves. So, but yeah, it's like anything we can think about, we can really write about. There's nothing that's really off limits, and that's kind of a really nice thing about being a writer for BuzzFeed, is that they really encourage us to just like write about what we want, you know?
I love that. I think it's great because there are some reporters and journalists who don't have that creative outlet, right?
Right.
They're told what to report. They're told they have to do
Mhm.
this or that because of ratings and because of controversy or struggle. But here, like you mentioned, BuzzFeed, they do it because they want you to just, have that creativity unleash, right? And you never know what happens when you can unleash that creativity. But was there a piece of like, what's your favorite content that you produced on BuzzFeed, or is there a favorite content?
That's hard.
Too many to mention?
It's fine because I was recently looking at the number of posts I've written, and I'm approaching 2,000 at this point. So there's
Oh,
stuff I've written.
wow.
Yeah, I'm at like 1900 something. And I'll scroll back sometimes and look at my old posts. I'm like, wow, I don't even remember writing this. Like, where was my brain back then? Um, I don't know. I'm trying to think. I mean, some of my favorite stuff we've talked about are the big things, like the Baby Yoda's Disney princesses, um, or the Keanu Reeves as Disney princes. It's just they're so fun to draw. They're just like, I don't know. For me, they're like that's like me being original and being creative, and having fun with my work. Um, yeah, sorry, I can't. I'm like, sure, there's some older stuff that I'm like, that was so cool, and I love doing that. But it's been a minute, so to like think back over the years of like what I've done. Because there's stuff that does like super well, that has like millions and millions of views. But I'm like, that was it's not it wasn't a passion of mine. It was just something kind of silly that I thought would be cool, and for whatever reason, it just like hit with audiences, and it's just like it's funny to see stuff take off that you're like, I mean, this is a very classic BuzzFeed thing where you'll like maybe spend like hours and days on something that's really precious to you, and it won't do particularly, like it'll do okay, you know. But then like you'll spend like maybe like 30 minutes on like a silly quiz, and it'll have like 10 million views, and you're like, cool. I don't know what I tapped into there, but I wasn't necessarily trying to like have that go. I mean, you're always trying to have something go viral because that's just like the goal. But like, yeah, it's interesting.
I like that. I mean, I know we always try to make things go viral, right? And it's usually the times when we don't really try is when it just kind of crazy takes off, right? And I like that you mentioned that not all things go viral because I think it's important to talk about that, right? Just because you're big you work for a big news media outlet doesn't mean every single article or every single quiz that they do has that viral sustainability, right? It's up and down, like anything else in life, right? It's up and down. It's not this straight, narrow arrow that goes through. Like it's not always viral every time you go out there and post something. It's a hit and miss sometimes, and we have to be okay with that. And amazing, 1900 news articles and quizzes and comics, like that is a great achievement, and I think we need to celebrate that, right? Because I mean, we tend to forget about our achievements, or we forget to think like, wow, we've gone through so much. I've done so many things. I've done over 1900 articles. I mean, we just have to give ourselves a pat on the back. And if someone's listening to this and wants to know about like how to get into becoming a writer or becoming an editor or working for BuzzFeed, what are some tips, or even just being able to do something they love and getting paid for it? I mean, what would be some advice you'd like to give to them?
It's hard to be able to be paid to do something you love and enjoy. That's a very rare position to be in, and I'm very lucky, and very aware that I'm lucky to be in that position. I think, because for a long time it wasn't. And you just got to keep like hustling. It's such like a boring thing to say, but like, what if your day job is boring, but you want to do something creative on the side? Take the time at night or when you have pockets during the day to just like work on that. And also, you got to be out there. You got to be like ready for the opportunities to come along when they happen. I wasn't expecting BuzzFeed to come along. I wasn't writing that kind of content before. Um, but I feel like these days, like, if you want to be a writer for a place like BuzzFeed, you got to like maybe try writing, even if it's something as simple as like you're writing your own blog and like you're creating your own content, and then try to like maybe do some freelance posts for some other outlets. There's a lot of places that are doing freelance. Even BuzzFeed has started doing work with freelancers, and just like submit your ideas, like, put yourself out there. Just keep creating is the main thing. You can sit there and want and wish as long as you want, but like at the end of the day, if your work isn't there and you aren't trying, like nothing's going to happen.
I love that. And it's so true, right? Actions speak louder than words. And I know sometimes it's easier said than done. And the hardest part is starting, right? I've been
Yeah, it's
there.
hard.
I've been guilty of it. Like, you kind of procrastinate and overthink to the point. If we just went out there and did it and make some mistakes along the way, we could go out there and create amazing things. So I really love that tip that you mentioned. And if our listeners wanted to check out some of your artwork or read some of your articles, is there any links or social media profiles we can connect with?
Yeah, I mean, my Instagram account is just at Crystal Row. I have a Twitter account, not very active on there. I mainly just retweet funny cat videos and stuff. But yeah, the Instagram account at Crystal Row, and I have a website that's crystal-row.com. So yeah, see it all there.
I love it. Well, first off, I want to thank our guest today, Crystal Rowe, for joining us. To learn more about Crystal and her work, please visit www.crystal-rowe.com. If you have any suggestions for future topics, we'd love to hear from you. Also, be sure to subscribe, as well as follow us on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. Please join us next week for another exciting and thought-provoking Asian Voices radio show. Until next week, I'm Sheena Yapchan. I'd like to thank you for listening. Take care until then, everyone.